with us here on the Saturday. We're just going to give folks a couple more minutes to come over from their second of our morning sessions. So just bear with us here about 2 minutes, and we're going to go ahead and kick things off. All right. Good afternoon. The 20th Annual Municipal Green Building Conference and Expo is very close to wrapping, but don't you worry. We still have some treats in store for you. Thank you so much for spending some of your Saturday with us. The time is indeed now. We are so excited to really build off of our conference today and really focus on action as we dive into the rest of the year. And we're all trying to figure out what's going to happen next as we emerge from this pandemic. But before all that happens, I'd like to introduce Robin Eason, who's a senior sustainability planner for the city of West Hollywood. She's been on our board for a number of years now and is also a delightful human being. So Robin, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. And hi, everyone. Yes, thank you for sticking with us. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. It is my esteemed pleasure and privilege today to introduce the uber talented and multi-hyphenate Mr. Christopher Locke as our final keynote speaker. I saw him present his work earlier this year and knew then that he would be a great addition to this year's conference and expo. Raised by hardworking and loving Jamaican family, Christopher challenges the established practices of architecture as a Black designer, spatial advocate, and filmmaker to create spaces for equitable and liberated change. He works as a designer in LA and is the co-founder of Designing in Color, an award-winning and talented collective of architects and designers of culture. Designing in Color's mission aims to diversify the way architecture is taught and practiced to amplify marginalized communities who've been historically silenced and erased throughout the design process. Working throughout the country, Designing in Color facilitates educational programming, creates workshops, designs socially responsible projects, and distributes digital initiatives, each meant to dismantle the systemic racism built into the practice of architecture. Christopher is also a member of Southern California National Organization of Minority Architects, where he is actively engaged in youth mentorship through the organization's Pipeline Project Summer Camp. In 2017, Christopher co-founded Small Talks LA, a community-based project created to assemble a network of people and construct safe spaces to unify the desperate voices of Los Angeles. With the creation of Designing in Color and Small Talks LA, he uses filmmaking as a method to study the current housing crisis across the city as a means of telling stories for narratives unknown. As a creative, he believes that new processes that center Black and Brown voices as the expertise of design innovation can create a more just society that unbuilds racism and white supremacy in the built environment. Christopher, I continue to be in awe of all you are, all you stand for, and all you do. Thank you so much for being here today, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. I'm honored to be here and be closing out the conference. I've heard so many great just activities and amazing people that this is a really awesome honor. Thank you, Robin, for inviting me in the whole chapter as well. Now, before I get started, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but I'm also going to summon our ancestors here who have who need to be a part of this space as we talk about the work that we're going to be doing today. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to pull it up. And before I get started talking a little bit more design and color and the work that we've done, I just want to, as I was saying before, summon our ancestors who are going to be in this space today in this conversation in the work that I will be talking about. So I'll begin with a short kind of introduction / poem. The prevalence of white space is a suffocating phenomenon, omnipresent and ominous. In many circumstances, the trauma it inflicts will leave its victims at the mercy of grasping for air. In architecture, the arrangements of its spatial hierarchies, formal languages, ignorance and consistent pressures of cultural erasures and sustained by white people and contrary to the belief of some designers, is not just an issue dependent on the configurations of poorly designed modernist buildings. Instead, it explicitly relies on the preservation of white supremacy and complicity of reinforcing racist policy found in a racialized space. White space is characterized by its consistent exclusion and harm of minoritized identities. Our future does not have to be defined by these histories of our past, but the liberation and power of our future. But the question is, how do we envision that future? So that brings us to today. And that brings us to a conversation about design and color and racialized space in the world, because it is very much omnipresent everywhere, and finding it and eradicating it is always a process. So what is design and color? Robin gave a very excellent description of it. Design and Color is an award-winning collective of architects and designers of culture. Our mission is to diversify the way architecture is taught and practiced to amplify marginalized communities who have been historically silenced and erased throughout the design process. We began in 2016 as a way to fundamentally change the Eurocentric curricula that existed in architecture education. Since that founding in 2016, after we all graduated from grad school, we've been trying to find a way not to just teach the way, we find new ways to teach the architecture, but also find other opportunities to involve communities, developers, and other people involved into the built environment to unbuild the decolonialized thoughts of how we build spaces.
Christopher,
So,
I hate to interrupt you, we can't see your slides, just so you know.
Oh, you can't see my slides?
No, we still see the Word doc.
You still see you see a Word doc. Oh, wow. You're not even supposed to see that at all. Okay, I'm going to back up if you guys are patient with me.
Patience we have.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to do screen. Oh, there you go. I see what the issue was. Do you all see that now?
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I already told you all what design and color is. That is the slide. That is my beautiful team of 6. And I'll actually go a little bit more into them. So our team consists of 6 designers. We're all located throughout Detroit, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Boston, Seattle. Design and Color is an organization we're building part-time to eventually become our full-time duty as designers, architects, and people who ultimately want to build a more just environment. We facilitate workshops, design socially responsible projects and initiatives, all meant to dismantle systemic racism built into architecture and these processes of building the built environment. Everything that we do is founded in the principles of social justice, spatial justice, and design equity. We want our partners, from professionals, students, everyone who works with us, to be excited in the process of pursuing justice, all while designing color. We see design and color as an adjective, a way in which you put process before the product to enable and uplift communities and voices who have been silenced. So before we get into talking a little bit more about racialized space, I first want to break down what racialized architecture is, which in a sense is racialized space. It can be defined as a spatial form of white supremacy, which, as you look at this diagram here, involves many different facets: imperialism, the process of extending the rule of countries over others. The United States of America was built on imperialism. This indigenous land that we live on and we exist in today was not ours. and that very much exists in the constructs of which it was developed in Africa and Asia, when those countries were also overtaken by rule by European countries. That scale and development of white supremacy has found its way into the United States of America through redlining, gentrification, and segregation. All of these policies and actions all relate back to white supremacy and the built environment. The question then, though, is how do we identify these things so we ultimately can eradicate and unbuild them from our cities? But before we get into that, I want to talk about a few examples and begin to ask the question, how have designers escalated the hostilities of public space? When we look at this image here, we see a defensible space. And I've gone throughout in my time being in Southern California and moving here about 4 or 5 years ago, you consistently see these images of defensible spaces, also known as crime prevention through our environmental design. You see these spaces that are ultimately created to defend people that are not perceived to have access or are not welcome, whether they be a houseless individual or someone who is not wanted in a space because of their creed, color, or their look. Whatever it may be, design can be used as a tool to weaponize and destruct people in space. The question is, how do you identify that? And why is design used as a tool to ultimately create a defensive mechanism that ultimately harms people? As you can see in all these examples, we see it everywhere. It's as simple as objects that might look aesthetically pleasing, but ultimately are constructed like this bench for something for you to not sleep on. These simple moves and these simple actions, whether understood or not, are destructive to our public environments. You will literally wake up with a crook in your neck. We can describe this as the lawscape versus the atmosphere. The lawscape being very much the policies and the attitudes of human beings in space, specifically as you see in this image here on the left, that is constructed in the civil rights era, in which we saw people's bodies brutalized by the policy and segregated minds of those who were putting the force in the lawscape, versus that of the atmosphere, the spaces and the environments that we live in and we exist in very naturally. These constructs together, they create this environment of white supremacy that we see. In the 1960s, we experienced and saw the signs that segregated spaces mentally, physically, emotionally, and in a way in which people understood their space and environment. It was destructive, one that still lives in the heart and soul of our communities. One that has found itself in the ways in which we reinforce policy, rule, and policing in the United States. But when it all comes back down to it, when we start to look at space and how it's ultimately used from the public streets and the environments that we use, the question comes back to commodifying hostile spaces is engraved into the historical injustices of this country. How do we dismantle them? I'll give you another example, one that you all are very familiar with. The siege of racial patriarchy on the left and the protection of civil rights on the right. These are the tale of two racialized spaces. And I want to specify, whiteness is a race. I think sometimes it's ultimately not seen as that, but whiteness is also a race and can be racialized. When you see the image on the left, something that we all became familiar with at the end of 2020, as we saw the racial patriarchy, those who are constructing white supremacy, white men overtaking the capital rule in our government. The same space is built by the hands of enslaved Africans in the United States in the 1600s who built these Capitol buildings. But conversely, on the right, you also have a racialized space, one that is inhabited by many people for the rights of Black Lives Matter, for the protection of civil rights. Both of these spaces are two tales of white supremacy, one reacting as a form of defense and advocacy, and another acting on the fear and the actions of perseverance. We see these two actions working together. And Mabel O. Wilson breaks this down very well. The absence upon which this whiteness is configured never truly disappears. It manifests itself aesthetically at the very sites of its erasure. So at the site of this action in this moment in time at the US Capitol in 2020, we saw this moment in which the violence that was put onto the space by a white racialized space was perceived very differently than that of the protection of civil rights and the spaces that we saw on the streets and the protests, not riots, in the summer of 2020. I'll give you one last example. Racialized space, when we look at it from the environmental racism that exists in the United States. The Ninth Ward in New Orleans is a very good example of this, unfortunately. From a design substantial, when we look at the condition of how racialized spaces are constructed, it includes design, policy, and condition. These three kind of simultaneously actions in existence of space. The design of historically redlined spaces in New Orleans. White residents and affluent residents lived in the higher spaces in the city, whereas the flood-prone and unprotected and vulnerable residents, often Black, lived in the spaces in New Orleans that were below sea level, making them vulnerable to the environmental and the climate changes that were happening in the United States. Now, a lot of people will react to Katrina and say it was incredibly a catastrophe for what happened because the levees broke and the city wasn't prepared. But that's far from the truth of just that situation. This has been decades and centuries of negligence and redlining as a policy and generational housing discrimination that ultimately helped lead to not only Black residents being permanently displaced from New Orleans and many cultures and many generations of Black-owned properties being completely removed, but it also still is involved in the reconstruction of the city today. Statistically, Black residents and their income rose by 7% since Katrina in 2005. But white residents, it has risen by nearly 25%. When we look at the environment and the constructs that relate to the physical environment in which are being built and experienced by policy, we also have to be acknowledge that environments and where people are ultimately put, and when we define racialized environmental spaces as disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color, Katrina is an incredible example of this, unfortunately. And Brian Seeley Jr., the founder of Co-Locate in New Orleans, defines it as white America has found it all too easy to transpose its capital and beliefs into physical space. The fear of living in that kind of part of the city ultimately related to the climate change impacting a specific disproportionate of people. So what are we doing to ultimately starting to interrogate and asking these questions? Our thesis for 2021 and 2020 was, how have designers contributed to the creation of racialized spaces? And through the program called Designing with Action, DWA, we began to interrogate not only how racialized spaces are developed, but how can we prioritize unbuilding that racism found in design cultures and communities? Culture for us is important because that culture ultimately can be understood, shared, and proliferated for generations to come. So developing this program, which we started last year, working with universities, workplaces, community groups, developers, and many other organizations, is broken into 3 workshops. Number 1, racialized architecture competency. It is so profoundly important that before we do and work on any issue that relates to race, identity, and any politics, we first understand the systems that ultimately play a part in marginalizing experiences for minoritized people. We have to understand the problem before we make any progress. Workshop number 2 then goes into many of the ideas that you all have experienced and seen today, design and spatial justice. Through the examination of design justice principles, how we prioritize an anti-racism policy and processes, not just a product of it, but ultimately try to create a process that is just. And then lastly, workshop number 3, how do we create sustainable futures that are ultimately held in accountability? What is the accountability that we need to hold our leadership in, our city officials in, and the leaders of organizations that help to lead people to make change? If we could create that dynamic by metrics, but also by conversations that keep people accountable, we can keep these ideas sustainable as well. So for design and color, we have many methodologies we break these down, and I'm going to share a few of them with you all today. One of them is called the Justice Triad, and it involves 3 elements: design, the pursuit of social and spatial and racial justice and cultural justice; spatial, the fair and equitable distribution in space socially valued resources, opportunity to use them, and inclusiveness, which you all may be familiar with, a methodology that embraces and draws the full range of human diversity, not just bringing people to the space, but drawing on the range of human diversity and expertise to create change. We created this diagram as a way to break it down in which people understand. And it involves multiple things. For us, inclusiveness, spatial, and design is broken down into 9 principles that within this triad interrogate the method of which how space is decolonized, how space is understood for where we can use the margins and work within the margins as a way to innovate. But to do that, there are many things that we have to consider, not just as architects, but as anybody who's involved in the designing of spaces. Because everybody on this call today, whether you are creating a simple sidewalk bench in your community or whatever it might be, or your organization is working with a variety of different people, you are a designer. So how can we use these elements to ultimately create a just process? That it may include some ideas like empowering the griot. The griot is also known as the Western African storyteller that is involved in the United States. And I'm going to grab my charger because my computer is going to die momentarily. Give me 1 second. So when we talk about empowering the griot, also known as the Western African historian and storyteller, is the center for cultural advice and information in the community. The person who is all well and knowing about the issues, the challenges, and the successes of that community. How can you center that person and its organizations and expertise at the center of justice and design to create new opportunities for change? How do we then, underneath the spatial understanding, build a spatial consciousness? An idea and a terminology I'll talk about a little bit later. And then most importantly, something that we think is incredibly crucial. How do we enact safe space around each other to ultimately create important and safe dialogue for the people that we want to make change with, not just for? So before we dive a little deeper into that, let's discover a couple of distinctions here. Anti-racist designers versus complicit injustice designers. Do you organize the resource of design to advance community justice and capacity building? And by that we mean, do you use your technical design and expertise to serve communities and build capacity for understanding the process? Do you remove and identify racialization and the injustice of spaces in its processes? Or, like Michael Ford said so brilliantly, are you complacent with the designing and constructing the backdrop to the injustice of design? And that might come in the form of designing the carceral state. That includes things like prisons, that includes things like courthouses that have holding cells, that includes all those things that ultimately disrupts and brutalize Black and brown bodies and non-conforming identities. These are the things and distinctions we must make. If we turn the blind eye, we are being complicit. It's not enough to not participate, we have to participate. So how do we begin to put these things into action? For us, it starts with identifying the cycle of exclusion. Adopted from Mismatch by Cal Holmes, which I highly recommend. Identify the cycle of exclusion starts with identifying the who, the what, the why, and the how. Ultimately, how do we interrogate the process of creating spaces, policy, and engagement and organizing with people so that we understand the blind spots that we may have as an organization, a people, or ultimately as an entire body of people? It might look like occupying safe space. Who is ultimately always left out of that? What is the data that supports that? What are those physical spaces? What are the visual breaks and defensible spaces? What do they typically are? Why are they created? What are the exclusionary design? Who supports it? What is the governing body behind that? What information do we ultimately need and how? How does inclusion ultimately break down, and what are the voices that we need to interrogate as a part of that? This process is something that if you involve in your multi-days of working through design and exercises and policy making, and just in general through anything that we do that engages any public kind of domain, it allows us to see what our blind spots are. But once you identify the cycle and we go back to those 9 principles we looked at earlier, we could then break the cycle. And the most important thing for us is becoming a trusted organizer. There are often, from the architectural perspective, a lot of people want to be God. They want to be the person who jumps in and saves the day and ultimately changes things. But we ultimately have a really strong duty to be a trusted organizer. And trust is an important part of the process. You have to first and foremost be able to be understood and be trusted by people who you're working with. We talked about enacting safe space around you. These are the who, and then the what, why, and how. The what, spatial consciousness, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Why? What is the systemic data behind that? What is the data that ultimately supports the potential issue? How can we ultimately extrapolate the issues that exist? It could be as simple as understanding why people aren't ultimately getting access to public transportation in this area, or why aren't they showing up to meetings? Maybe the meeting's on the wrong time. Very simple things that ultimately help us not exclude people who ultimately need to be a part of the process, who have been silenced for many decades. So I was talking about spatial consciousness before. For us at Design in Color, and for myself personally, a spatial consciousness relates to W.E.B. Du Bois's definition of double consciousness. So he described double consciousness as this. Double consciousness forces Blacks to not only view themselves from their own unique perspective, but to also view themselves as they might be perceived by the outside white world. This is what W.E.B. Du Bois spoke of as the sense of looking at oneself through the eyes of others. So I'll give you an example. Me being a Black man, if I'm walking down the street, I ultimately have to be conscious of how other potentially white people might view me. Do you see me as a threat? Do you see me as somebody who's ultimately going to bring you harm? Or are you going to respond to that by potentially calling the police and escalating a matter that ultimately puts me in harm's way? This is something that I'm pretty sure a lot of people go throughout their daily basis who might not be of a conforming identity. One of those might also exist to wearing a mask. And wearing a mask for me, and then seeing a mother and child cross the street and not knowing if it's because I'm Black or because we're all wearing masks. It's that consciousness that consistently plays in our minds as a form of defensive mechanisms to survive. But when we think about that in the terms of designing and constructing policy and processes to create change, how can we think about how other people are going to perceive things so that we ultimately create spaces and opportunities that is thinking ahead of what the potential challenges and issues could be for other individuals? So what are some of the things that we're doing as an organization? And some of these things here include Black and Brown pedagogy. We believe that creating sacred spaces in relation to racialized spaces, sacred space being a space that is ultimately important and safe for anybody who can be in that space, is important. Black and Brown pedagogy, the ideas of creating a conversation around imposter syndrome. What does it mean to be the only woman, the only Black woman in design? What does that look like? How is it constructed? What are the spaces and the conversations that need to happen to demystify that space? How do we change that? How do we focus on that process? Designing by response. How do we design by receiving information, but ultimately participating in the process of creating the program for that information? Oftentimes as designers, we wait to provide a service to a developer, to a client, to a variety of different people without ultimately being a part of the process of how that information was constructed. If we can be a part of that process, then we can help flip the narrative from seeking just a product, but also reinforcing how justice is created and served. And then liberation as workshop and organizing with communities. The duality of these two relates to the education. If we can change how people are ultimately receiving information from a very different perspective, one that is centering Black and Brown non-conforming identities and celebrates the beauty of the diversity of that, we can find new challenging alternatives to creating space. I'm going to give you all a couple of examples as we close out. In doing that, we actually follow this practice, which is rooted in activism. And it involves challenge our 3 C's: challenge, collaborate, and create. First and foremost, what is the system that you're ultimately trying to challenge? What the hell is it? That's the main question we always ask ourselves. What is this thing that ultimately gives us fear, but also makes us feel vulnerable? We have to first understand the thing that discourages marginalized groups. Once that is identified, How do we collaborate and ultimately unify groups, diverse groups, to activate space and find common goals for dialogue, achievable, and effective? And then lastly, create. The create part for us in design and color is not specifically just about a product. It's not specifically just the building. It's not specifically just the entity that needs to be created that becomes a ribbon cutting opportunity. It's the opportunity for creating a process, a safe space for community discussion, content, things that ultimately change the narrative of how people participate in an environment that makes them feel safe and heard. I'll give you all a couple of examples of that. Small Talks LA was created as a project in Los Angeles in 2017 to organize the disparate voices in the city. And using the challenge, collaborate, create methodology, we want to organize neighborhoods that have existing initiatives. There are so many existing initiatives in Los Angeles. So how can we create them and bring them together to have important, crucial, and vulnerable conversations about injustice and justice, while also providing the tools to community members to talk about design, to use it as a weapon against the white supremacy that exists in our environments. So by having conversations about gentrification in Inglewood, or having conversations about homelessness and displacement and cultural asylums, the spaces that we live in the city, in the arts district, or revolving the conversation about student work and how it can be used as an opportunity to catalyze existing initiatives, was something that we've done, and operating and using culture as a way to do that. All of our Small Talks LA events have used art, design, culture, music as a way to bring people together. If you want to provide for the block, you got to bring the block together in a way that culture is understood and people feel safe. The last example I'll give you here is Cal Innocent Park, which is a project that we're working on with an organization called Black Star Farmers in Seattle. So as you can see in the images here, something that we've seen just traumatically throughout Los Angeles is our homeless population. And houseless individuals who live in the park ultimately don't have access to food. There's a lot of food inequity that exists in Seattle as a result. So a man named Marcus Henderson, the founder of Black Star Farmers, grabbed a shovel and he started digging. He started digging and creating a guerrilla form of design justice that ultimately would create a garden and spaces for people to have food and access to while they live in the park. So the question we ask ourselves in this construct is, how can Cal Innocent Park celebrate food justice and use an Afrofuturistic lexicon to negate the historical revisionism of European-based design? One of the challenges that's happening with this park is the city is bringing up a lot of Eurocentric and defensible space ideas, also known as crime prevention through environmental design, to create and construct spaces that would ultimately remove most of the homeless population, create a lot of hardscapes, a lot of spaces people wouldn't be able to move in. Through dialogue and conversations with Black Star Farmers and in the future with more members, we want to create a process that ultimately finds a solution that works for everybody, but it ultimately finds a new way to have a dialogue. So a couple of examples of this is this idea of a Black Lives Memorial Garden. So this image you see here is a part of a campaign. It's a campaign that looks to leverage the idea of how can we work together and analyze and also observe our past, present, and future when we're looking at Cal Innocent Park, which used to be and still is a large LGBTQI plus IA plus organization and environment. And also observing the indigenous tribes that have also found home to Cal Innocent Park historically, and the Black Lives Matter movement as well. This campaign looks to gather people together to construct not only conversations around design and what they think the park needs to be, but also analyzing the space through a working party, as also known as gardening, working, and discussing design, putting people's hands in the dirt and also doing it together. So the way in which we started to look at this process is trying to find alternative inspirations using the principles that we talked about before. So first and foremost, non-defensible spaces. What do they look like and how can we ultimately deconstruct them so they ultimately do not make other people feel like they're violated? If you remember those images we looked at before, they're so prevalent. Knowledge sharing, whether it be through the crop making parties and the idea of using the body as a way to engage with the earth, but also understand design as a process that's going to be involved in the creating of an alternative park here. and then limiting historical revisionism. Revisionism being the removal of the existing culture that is there to create a new, which is often what has happened in the United States of America, specifically looking at indigenous tribes and many of the gentrified locations and cities throughout our country. But the most important one I want to focus on today is narrative-based strategies. And capoeira, which is a mixed martial art, dance, and movement, and also a form of defense that was used by enslaved Africans in Brazil, they used to gather in circles, also known as the roda, which was a very safe but also engaging circle in which spectators watch their comrades engage in space and work together in these movements that are about body engagement in a scale that ultimately feels vulnerable but safe. This action and movement is something that we love to see in the idea of a circle. So using that cultural understanding and gathering, we also looked at, okay, the tents that also exist as a spatial scale. How do we use that also as a way to design the spaces that exist in the park? So as a way of understanding space, we also started to look at, okay, how can we also engage the Afrofuturistic lexicon and understanding capoeira, but also understanding the use of art and design. We started to create a couple of typologies of space that you see on the left, using benches, spaces, and different art and food, planter boxes, and things that engage the earth through the various systems that many of you have heard of today, but also the idea of using simple, very simple engagements with the earth, using ideas that engage art, that engage ideas of how we share information, all these things that we talked about within the justice triad principles. How can we bring them all together to create learning opportunities, building opportunities, to create a process that then could eventually inform what the park should look like? And this is a process that's ongoing. There's going to be a series of workshops in the park this coming summer, and engagements that some of our members in Seattle will be engaging with. We hope that you all follow this process and this journey to see how it's continuing to move. But designing just the objects is not enough anymore. If you want to be an anti-racist designer, we must first identify those issues and challenges so we can break them down. And as I wrap up this conversation today that I hope you all enjoyed, I want to leave you all with a quote. And this is the beautiful, and powerful, engaging, and brilliant Mabel Wilson, professor and director at Columbia. And she says, I always tell people that if you want to find out the history of African-American architecture, you have to go back and look at all the builders who, particularly by the 20th century, weren't licensed architects. There were other ways that people were building and thinking about space, but it isn't the stuff that ends up in the history books or recorded by the local chapters of professional association. But it's out there, so you have to look elsewhere. So I'll leave you all with this. Look elsewhere. We find our catalyzed thoughts, our inspirations in places and spaces that are sometimes so minuscule, but are very beautiful, that are very also constructed in a way that might not be pretty. But the constructs of those things, the creation of those things are what makes them so cultured. And if we understand culture as a way that is the defensive mechanism to oppression, we use culture as a way to survive. We use culture as a way to move spaces. We use culture as a way to also create spaces that we feel comfortable in, which is why Los Angeles has so many different cultures throughout the city. But ultimately, how do we look elsewhere as designers? Because all of us here are that. And I look forward to all of you all working with us, engaging with us, reaching out to us, having a conversation with us. Please reach out to us on our various social media engagements. And I want to thank the group here and the LA chapter so much for inviting me, Robin specifically for reaching out. I've enjoyed this opportunity with you all today. Thanks for being patient with me. Love y'all and have a fantastic afternoon. God bless.
Thank you, Christopher. That was actually really amazing. I think it's going to reframe how I look at design all around me in the spaces that we occupy and encounter on a day-to-day basis. And I really appreciate that perspective. It really opened my eyes a lot. I really appreciate that. And to close us out for today, this is the final part of our 20th annual Municipal Green Building Conference and Expo. We have the artist A.Y. Young AY is a producer, singer, songwriter, entertainer, entrepreneur. His Battery tour, which we're hoping that we'll have a chance to see here in 2022, is really looking at how to unite the musical experience and cooperation around this engagement for sustainability and looking at the UN Sustainable Design Goals. You know, I don't think anyone can explain it better than AY himself. So if we can cue up the video here, we're really pleased to bring a performance to close out our community day here at MGBCE.
Yo, what's up? How's everybody doing in the green building community? My name is A.Y. Young, founder of the Battery Tour and one of the 17 United Nations Young Leaders for the SDGs. And guys, I am inspired. This is an incredible, impactful event. I'm so happy to be a part of it. I'm motivated. My passion is using music as a vehicle to help bring and promote change and bring people together. And I love things like this. Yo, with that being said, guys, here's a little bit about me, my story, and why I'm here.
A local hip-hop artist makes an international name for himself. He is the first artist to power his concert with 100% renewable energy.
It is a real honor to recognize Mr. A.Y. Young, the founder of Battery Tour.
It's incredible. Can't wait for you to see this. The United Nations is now throwing its support behind him.
Mr. Young has made a big impact in his young life, born in 1991. He's a singer-songwriter, a dancer, producer, entrepreneur, and sustainability advocate. He's staged and performed more than 800 concerts. He was named by the United Nations recently as one of 17 youth world leaders of the world, the only individual selected for that honor from the United States.
Forward to stimulating this local economy further, bringing entrepreneurs together, bringing businesses together, bringing the world together so we can make some change. Yeah. A lot of people don't know there's over 1 billion people who lack access to energy. I'm AY with the Battery Tour, and we're here in Honduras. It's beautiful. We send, develop, and deploy renewable energy to people around the world that need it. It's all about getting people access to electricity.
Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at me like I'm from another planet.
We stored energy in batteries and then use it to do a concert.
Solar power, wind and
I always wanted the world to hear my music, this message of positivity and spreading love. I just wanted to say hey to the world. You know, it's okay to be yourself. So I'm really here to help just push that message and get the world plugged in to renewable energy. Oh, so I hope you guys enjoyed my story. That's what sparked, you know, Project 17, this journey on getting the world plugged in and access to energy, which is goal 7. Now, guys, Project 17 is simple. We are going to achieve the SDGs in 3 phases. I'm doing the world's first sustainable album, 1 song for each of the 17 sustainable development goals, and each record is going to be in collaboration with 1 or more of Earth's biggest artists. Now, phase 2 of Project 17, I'm going to do a tour in the US because I'm the young leader from the US. 17 dates, right? We're going to bring the music to the people. And the third step is releasing a guidebook and a roadmap through the United Nations to all the artists in the world to say, hey, this is how you tour sustainably. Here are the stakeholders, the impact influencers and impact partners involved, the people that created the change with Project 17. So we're getting the world plugged in right now, and you should be an outlet for change and plug in as well.
Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at us like we from another planet. Woo! Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at us like we from another planet. Woo! Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at us like we from another planet. Ooh. Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at us like we from another planet. Ooh. They acting like we from another planet, Mars. They say climate change ain't a thing. What you talking about? What you know about that? What's your carbon offset? Facts. We just wanna act. We ain't sitting back. Solar power. When it's solar power, everybody need the energy. Let's store it up and power the world. Recycle. We need more recycle, but you're acting like some followers on Instagram and Twitter, yeah? So tick tock, don't let the ball drop. The clock starts now, plug in, baby. Planet. So tick tock, don't let the ball drop. The clock starts now, plug in. We gon' say the planet. So tick tock, don't let the ball drop. The clock starts now, plug in. We gon' say the planet. So tick tock, don't let the ball drop. The clock starts now. Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at me like I'm from another planet. Woo! Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at me like I'm from another planet. Ooh. Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at me like I'm from another planet. Ooh. Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at me like I'm from another planet. Ooh. Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at me like I'm from another planet. Ooh. Say the planet, we gon' say the planet. Everybody looking at me like I'm from another planet. The ocean is alive. Keep the plastic out. The ocean is alive. So keep the plastic out. The ocean is alive. Keep the plastic out. The ocean is alive. So keep the plastic out. Yeah. Let's save the planet.
Yo, okay, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I will take my leave, but I wanted to say that I'm inspired, man. There's so many great people like all of you here that are doing great things in sustainability, that are doing incredible build projects, that are doing just incredible things in this space in general. Keep up the work. I'm a firm believer that we can do anything, that we are all outlets for change, right? Whether we're a company, a corporation, an individual, an influencer on social media, a kid in the school, right? We are all outlets for change and plugged in, to each other, plugged into the local community. We can achieve and do anything. So, hey, if you guys want to get plugged into Project 17, get plugged into the Battery Tour. My name is AY. Good night, guys.
Wow, that is a tough act to follow and a great way to close out our community day here at MGBCE. It's time to take action. The time is now. We have everything we need. We have the people together. So many things to think about from today, and I leave you all to the rest of your weekend, and we hope to see you soon. Remember, we're here because we're all about people who are doing good work. Help us help you make an impact, and enjoy the rest of your weekend, everyone.